All right, and we're live. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the Strength Connection. And I am with the Hebrew Hammer himself again, Alex. What's up, man? Thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, no doubt. So, it's funny. I feel like we connected not that long ago. It's been a minute. It's been over like a year since the last time we did this, and we've done quite a
So,
few now. So,
yeah, this has got to be what I think the fourth because I did one when it was it you and Chris had a podcast?
we did. That was their first one when we had the Breakthrough
Yeah,
Secrets, and then
that's right.
this is our third. This is our trilogy episode of the Strength Connection that we've had.
Right,
But I've also been on your show, so we've collaborated quite a bit, over the years. So,
exactly.
yeah,
And we met like now it'll be wow, I think 13 years ago because it was at the so it's the bar mitzvah year.
yeah, it
In
is.
fact, it was at the Easy Strength in Reno, Nevada.
It's still one of my favorite events I ever went to, was that one.
Yeah. It was, I remember I was being young and naive. I was like, oh, they're going to do this like every year because this is so good. Like, why wouldn't they do it every year? It's like, it just boggled my mind that we were lucky enough that that brief moment in time where they did the one workshop they ever did on
Mhm.
that book. It was, yeah, it was incredible.
That was a beautiful moment right there. And then everything split after that, like pretty much right afterwards, which everything. So obviously there was probably some bunch of stuff behind the scenes that nobody
There
knew
was.
about. But to have in person Pavel and Dan John with like a group of 25 for 3 days, like
Yeah.
that's pretty special. I look back on my time in this community of being really fortunate that I got in early enough that a lot of these people were still teaching like every weekend. Like Pavel was still doing all this stuff. Dan, like they were
Yeah.
collaborating. Like it is really special.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And it's hard to describe to the people who joined later what those early days were like because we didn't really get in I guess at the very beginning because it started in like 2001, but it
Mhm.
still felt like you were a little bit in that pioneer stage. It was like still new and cool and like and fresh, and now it's established. It's better
Mhm.
known. It has a lot more notoriety throughout the strength and conditioning world. But it really wasn't like that back then. It was like now everybody knows what a kettlebell is. Nobody knew what a kettlebell was in
Yeah.
2012. People would look at you like you were nuts, when you like, oh, I lift kettlebells. They're like, I don't get it. You'd be like, yeah, it's like a weight with a handle. They're like, you
Yeah.
mean? I remember one time somebody was like, isn't that thing where you have like the ice and you roll it? And I'm like, no, that's definitely a. I don't even know what that's called, but I know it wasn't that. Like that's not kettlebell.
Yeah,
Like,
no, there had a little bit of like that underground feel to it when I got in.
yeah.
And I think it was also like I got into everything, in coaching from the FMS system. So with Gray Cook and Lee, and at the
Mm,
same time, that was still when FMS was kind of gaining its legs. So Gray
yeah.
and Lee and Brett were going all over the country teaching in-person workshops to anybody that would, pay money to come and check this out. So I was like, I went right from learning that stuff from Gray Cook himself immediately to going and having Brett come over to my gym in Little Clifton Park here, who did like I think it was the first level two, and then got to go like 6 months later to the RKC and meet Pavel right there, in front. So it is, and there probably is. I mean, as it got hyped up, right, there's more competition, other programs that came out, so that probably popularized it a little bit more. But it is. I still feel very fortunate to kind of get in that almost golden age when it really boomed up.
You know what? If you want to hear a really funny story, the competition started immediately. Like Pablo, after he did the first RKC in 2001, somebody, uh, one of the participants went off and started a competing certification, like right off the bat.
Yeah, they really. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I don't remember. I think it might have been. I don't remember who told me the story, but yeah, whoever told me the story was like, "How are you ready to certify other people? You just literally just went through a certification." So, yeah, people understood. Some people understood very early on that it was going to be a big deal, and so they wanted to get in, you know,
Mhm.
when they could. But yeah, it's true. Now there is a lot more competition. There are a lot more, varying different organizations and
Mhm.
certifications, but there will only ever be one Pavel and one strong first, as far as I'm concerned.
No doubt, 100%. I just realized why it feels like I've spoken to you more recently is because you pop into my mind quite a bit during my training right now. Because
Nice.
my one focus I am working on a lot is my hanging leg raise.
Oh, there
Um,
we go.
yeah, and I remember a while ago, I was trying to aesthetically, you know, look at your work and be like, I want mine to look like Alex's when he does that. And I've been
I'm
building it
flattered.
up and working. I got a clean 15 right now. That feels
That's
good.
impressive.
But it is a weird one that like it's one of those that second set immediately diminishes down, from there.
Yeah.
It's one of those that it is really challenging to keep that volume up there from set to set.
Yeah, I think the key is that you've got to do a lot fewer than what you could do. So, like, if you could do 15, like sets of five are probably where to go. The other thing, actually, you don't need a lot of weight, but I found, for instance, that like adding like ankle weights, for instance, can be helpful.
Oh,
Be-
okay.
But you have to think too, especially I don't know how long your legs are. I have like stork legs. So for me, it's like the further out it gets, like just the more awful it becomes.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I've added I think 10 pounds in the past to my leg raises and done sets of
Mhm.
at least five, maybe more. But that's a one set thing and you're done. It's like because again, it gets to the point where you just can't keep up. So I think the other thing too is that if you really backfill your training with much easier variations, like there's one variation I'm a big fan of. The I call it the non-hanging leg raise or the door jam leg raise, where you just kind of
Mhm.
sit in the door jam, push into the frame of the door, and do leg raises like that. Those can help to make sure that you
Oh,
get
okay.
volume in, and it sort of raises the floor, as it were. So I find it makes it a lot easier to go from, the 5 to 10 leg raises or 10 to 15. And a couple months ago, I hit 20, and a lot of it was from doing the higher rep, easier variations to the tune of like sets of 20 and things like that.
Sure. I would assume it's good too, because if the weakness you have maybe is just holding onto the bar and the grip of that, you can still get your volume in without, having so much of that hang position in there
Yeah.
if that's a little bit of a, something that's not as strong for you.
I think, yeah, that's number one. That's definitely true. Another thing that actually helps a lot is improving your pull-ups because you might already have the strength in your midsection and in your hips and things like that. But if your back's not very strong, and you basically there is some lean back that has to happen as your legs come up, unless you
Mhm.
have your back up against a wall. But that's harder in terms of just the
Right.
flexibility required. So it's like it's not a good trade off. You'd be like, oh, I'll just make sure there's something behind my back. No, you're making it way worse. So if
Yeah.
your back is stronger, you definitely do need to have good grip and grip endurance. But then, yeah, the other thing is making sure that, particularly if you can manage full range of motion,
Mhm.
if you train in a gym, this would be easy to do. But you get like an incline machine or an incline bench, and you put it up against like a Smith machine or even a squat rack, and then you put your hands on a barbell or something sturdy, and then you bring your legs to that bar. So you're not you're holding on to it. You're doing like a miniature version,
Oh, okay.
but you can very often hit like if you can do 15 leg raises, you could probably do
Mhm.
20 or 25 with your back on that bench.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. I never even thought of that. Oh, very
Yeah, if
cool.
you look up my name and then on YouTube and then you look up like hanging leg raise or non-hanging leg raise or leg raise progressions, you're probably going to find a video or two of that because I put a couple of them out there.
Mhm.
But it's awesome. And if you can jerry rig something like that at home, if you train at home, then it's even better.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. This is actually a topic I want to dive into, and we'll probably get even to it more. But as I've gone, and I think you're probably in a similar situation now, training for getting up on a couple decades, now, and now going into a new decade of life, my training and focus has shifted and changed quite a bit of what I try and keep strong and what's really important from there.
Sure.
And I've actually got I always had a affinity and a respect for body weight training.
Yeah.
But now it seems like it's even heightened even more of keeping these qualities up as I go up. Recovery is a little bit different,
Yeah.
as you go up from there. And it seems like the more I've kept my body weight, techniques in pull-ups, hanging leg raises, even hardstyle push-ups. Like everything else seems like it just stays at least at that maintenance level and that strength level to keep working on other things as well.
Totally. You think about it, it makes perfect sense. You've got like, um, you know, you all gravity is always going to be pulling on you, and it's never going to stop. And so as you get older, you've also got other issues like, um, I think it was Czech physiologist Vladimir Yanda, who was the director of the WHO, not the band, the World Health Organization,
Mhm.
in the 80s, and he talked about tonic versus phasic muscles. You've got some muscles that get tighter and some that get looser. And incidentally, the ones that get tighter pull you forward into kind of that hunchback position that we know
Right.
so well. And the others loosen up so that it's easier to pull you into that position. So that's not good. So if you can, the better you can defy gravity in general, both in terms of gentle movements like the original strength resets and the stretches and mobility movements that help you to maintain kind of that more youthful posture and movement. And then you can also defy gravity with strength like pistol squats and one arm push-ups and hanging leg raises and pull-ups and things like that. It really does go a long way in helping you to retain your overall youthful movement. It's not the only thing that you need to do,
Mhm.
but I'm convinced it's high on the list of pretty much anybody who's serious about it.
I love it. Yeah. So I want to talk about the new book and get in,
Oh, yes.
the Kick-Ass Insider's Guide to Kettlebell Complexes. I've got many questions and we'll dive into that. But
Great.
first, just catching up, the last time we spoke is you were living in the Midwest of the US, and now you made a big life change and you've moved back over from Tel Aviv, and now I forget, I apologize, where you are now.
Ramat Gan.
Ramat Gan. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the thought process and what's been life like of moving from the US and wanting to go back over into Israel?
Well, I always like to say, Midwest and Mideast. It really
Yeah.
kind of summarizes the polar opposites of the two cultures. But it had been on my mind for a long time. I moved back to the U.S. in 2017, and I had the intention to come back. It was always in the back of my mind that I would come back. I moved for a variety of reasons, but one of them was our friend Pat Flynn. He suggested very strongly. He had been suggesting for years that I move to PA, Pennsylvania, so that
Mhm.
he and I could collaborate on some projects, and the opportunity arose in late 2017 ish. So I was like, all right, you know what? I'm going to do it. So moved there. And then it was probably about the beginning of 2019, I started to, think about it more consciously about coming back. And initially, I had planned to make a visit in 2020. Probably don't need to explain to everybody why it didn't end up really coming to fruition. So
Sure.
I ended up kicking the can down the road for a few years because it was just not feasible to go for a visit. Um, and yeah, and then I decided that I was definitely going to do it in 2023. But I had like some bureaucratic things that I had to deal with. It was mostly just like I had to update my passport because it was expired, and because I have an Israeli passport as well as an American passport, and the Israeli passport was expired, but because they had so many expirations because of COVID and nobody was traveling anywhere, and they had all these updates they had to make. People with foreign passports, they were meaning U.S. in this case, they were like you can travel on your U.S. passport or whatever foreign passport you might have,
Mhm.
and you have an extension so you don't have to get yours updated until later. And I had the genius idea. I thought, oh, well, I'll just get it updated in the United States because there's probably not that many people, who are going to try to get it updated in the US. And in much the same way that the writing system is backward in Hebrew, the thinking system evidently is backward as well because it took longer to get my passport, my Israeli passport, updated. Whereas I heard people were getting them updated much more easily in
Mm.
Israel itself, which you would think with the amount of, the sheer number of people trying to get the updates,
Sure.
it would have been harder. So I don't know for sure, but I think that was the case. Fortunately, somebody at my synagogue had a connection with somebody at the consulate in Chicago. So he was able to put in a nice word for me. And I don't know if they really expedited it or if it was close to being done anyway. But all I know is that like a couple of days after he talked to them, I got an email saying you'll have your passport in a couple of,
Mhm.
you'll have your passport in a couple of weeks or something like that. But then October 7th happened. And for people who don't know what I'm referring to, Israel was invaded by Hamas, and that horrible massacre of civilians and people were taken hostage into Gaza, and that really didn't change my stance. I was like, well, I'm going to go anyway, you know. But no, I it was a little harder to convince my dad, and
Sure.
you know, it's not like I didn't. I could have done it whenever. It didn't really matter. I didn't need his approval, but at the same time, you know, you don't want to be like, okay, I'm going to move away, and now we have to do it while you disagree, and we have an argument, and it's like kind of a not,
Right.
you know. So I, out of respect for him, I was like, okay, I'm going to hold off it a little bit, and you know, we'll see what
Mhm.
happens. And and so I had a conversation with him a couple of times, and he was like, just wait, you know, now's not the good time. Things are bad. Wait till it calms down. I was like, it's never gonna calm down.
Right.
Like this
Yeah.
is like, uh, I think what this is just my assumption. I don't know this for sure, but I think after what I like to call Operation Grim Beeper, after that happened, he was like, "All right, you know, you're fine. You can go." If you're not familiar with it, or people who aren't sure what I'm referring to, you're getting a very very brief, you know, 30,000 foot view of a portion of the Middle East conflict. There are a lot of Middle East conflicts, but in terms
Mhm.
of this one, there's a Shia terrorist organization called Hezbollah that was effectively in control of much of southern Lebanon, and they were kind of calling the shots in a lot of things, and they were extremely well armed. They had like something to the tune of like 100,000 missiles and rockets pointed at Israel from Israel's border, like right on the border with Lebanon. And they're allied with Hamas, who invaded Israel and have started a number of different wars, as well as Iran, which is kind of the head of the snake, as it were.
Yeah.
And so, in any case, the Israeli version of of the CIA, which is called the Mossad, had had managed to infiltrate. I mean, they infiltrated, you know, tons of different terrorist groups, but in this case in particular, they also sold the Hezbollah these beepers, analog beepers, to take advantage of their fear of being watched and monitored via their digital devices. So they had these. So you know you can communicate with beepers still, and you can't hack a beeper. So
Right.
no way. You know they knew there's no way that the Israeli intelligence services were going to be able to keep track of what they were doing via the beepers, except for that the Mossad sold it to them, and they included explosives in all of them, and they at a, it was sometime in September of last year. They blew them up simultaneously. And if you were important enough to have a beeper, you were important. And thousands of these beepers went off and killed and injured high ranking terrorists all across Lebanon. And then after that, it was like, you know, the gloves came off and Israel effed up a bunch of the terrorist
Yeah.
leadership across Lebanon and so on and so forth. So it was, I mean, probably one of the most brilliant intelligence operations in history. I think out of the thousands of terrorists who were wounded, it managed to only injure like two civilians, which is like, I mean,
Wow.
generally, yeah, generally there's a guy at the I think it's West Point. I think he's a professor at West Point, which is like the #1 military academy in the U.S. I went to a talk that he gave, and he said that something like most conflicts around the world, the estimate is that the ratio of like civilian to
Mhm.
combatant casualties is like one combatant and nine civilians. So it's
Yeah.
like this is why war really is hell, and
Mhm.
people, you know, why it's just like if you can avoid it, by all means, avoid it.
Right.
So uh, yeah, they did an amazing job at really only getting to the people who
Really?
needed.
Seriously?
Yeah, and so anyway, I don't know what the official term is for this operation, but humoristically, people have been calling it Operation Grim Beeper.
Grim Beeper. It's
Uh,
yeah,
yeah,
that's a beautiful spin.
yes, exactly. So after that happened, I maybe it was a week or so later, I brought it up with him again because again, it was my plan to go back. Um, but I wanted to leave, like I said, I wanted to leave with his blessing. I didn't want to leave with you know, a lot of like friction or what
Sure.
have you. And he was like, yeah, okay, you know, you're probably gonna be all right. I think that was kind of like the sign that you know,
Yeah.
they got it under control.
Okay. And when was that? So officially, how long have you been there?
Uh, Came back in mid-October of last year, so it's only been a couple of months.
Gotcha. Okay. And now you lived there before, then you came back and then you went back. Is there a different like feeling of like the flow of culture and stuff like that now versus when it was before? As you said, like I mean, it's been a rough space for a long time in conflict. Obviously, right now is very big. It's a global type thing. Have you felt that at all, just kind of like in the day to day?
Uh, a little bit, yeah, because when I came back in October, I was initially I had a friend who was out of town, and I made a deal with him that I would cat sit his cat, so I would give his regular cat sitter a break, and so I was at his apartment cat sitting his cat, and then after that, I went up to Haifa, which is about 2 hours north, which is closer to the northern border, which had a lot of issues with like rocket attacks, and because there were so many coming in, something like 70,000 Israelis were like internally displaced, meaning they had to leave their homes in northern Israel and take up temporary shelter elsewhere because the barrages were so frequent. Now it's gotten considerably better because Israel's destroyed most of the terrorist infrastructure in Lebanon, and so people have been able to move back. But when I was a couple days up in Haifa, I mean, it was like two or three times a day, rocket sirens would go off, and you'd have to run to a shelter. You have a couple seconds to get to a shelter. And Israel has a very sophisticated. They have a series of sophisticated air defense systems. The most famous one is Iron Dome, and so you would hear, the rocket sirens going off, and then you could hear like explosions in the background where Iron Dome was shooting the rockets out of the sky, so that they were not going to land in civilian areas and kill people.
Hmm.
Uh, and I don't know how frequently they're going off anymore, but it was January. I was in Tel Aviv for a weekend, and I was just on a walk on the beach. Same thing. There was incoming missile siren. I think this one was from Yemen, and so people who are enjoying some time at the beach had to try to race to like a parking garage or wherever they could manage. And again, it's not you don't feel it as much right now. But my understanding is that late 2023, early 2024 was significantly
Yeah.
rougher, and I didn't happen to be there during that time.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's so interesting. We can easily get so sheltered into our own kind of bubble of things and we like you hear about it, but to hear about it from first stance in there, I think is so
Yeah.
valuable and important from there. So, all right, well, interesting segue now. Let's dive into this book, okay?
Yes. Yes.
First off, your front cover illustrations are the best of any books that I have. Because
I'm glad to
one
know.
is I know you, so I know your humor and like the comic book aspect of it, so there's such a personality to it. But
Yeah.
it's also so many books about strength and the work that we do is like such seriousness that you bring this element of like in my head, I'm like, yeah, this shit's supposed to be fun. That's like what I
Exactly.
have from there. Is that intentional at all? And like, where do you get these illustrations? Is it one person, or have you kind of explored different ones?
Yeah, no, there's a guy. So a very good friend of mine, Eduardo Carlesi, is the bassist for a very popular comedy heavy metal band in Italy called Nanowar of Steel. And what's funny is that I didn't realize what a big deal they were because I met Eduardo. He was doing postdoctoral research in astrophysics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So when I lived in Jerusalem in between 2014 and 2017. He was there, I think, from 2014 to maybe 2017 actually. So I met him probably in 2015, I think, and he and I originally met because I wanted to improve my Italian and he wanted to improve his Hebrew. In fact, that's what we started our conversation off
Mhm.
before. We are talking about Hebrew is once again a spoken language. It
Mhm.
did go. I'll give a very very brief answer here. For a long time, it was largely a liturgical language, meaning it was only used in studying the Bible and Hebrew prayers and that happened during in about 586 BCE. the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, and they pushed all the Jews into exile in Babylon. And the main language of Babylon was Aramaic, which now I would say is a little bit more like Hebrew was back then, in the sense that very few people speak it as a spoken language. So it was 70 years as was the exile into Babylon, after which Cyrus the Great of Persia defeated the Babylonian exile. And Cyrus was just an all-around good guy, and he's like, anybody who was conquered by the Babylonians and sent out of their homeland, you can go back. And he is said to have even offered a donation to the rebuilding of the temple, so the second temple in Jerusalem. But by this point, most Jews spoke Aramaic as their main language, and there were pockets. There was a small pocket, I think, in northern Israel, in even during the time of Jesus, where there were people who spoke Hebrew as their main language, but it was probably like 95% were speaking Aramaic, and they knew Hebrew because that's where their liturgy was in, and that was the language of the
Are they
Bible.
closely similar at all, Aramaic and Hebrew?
Very similar.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, I mean, I would say it's like maybe like Spanish and Italian.
Okay, I was gonna say like Spanish and Italian.
Exactly. They're really quite similar. I mean, it's not. Okay, so for instance, ancient Moabite. I was taking a biblical Hebrew course a couple of years ago, and at one point, at one of the higher levels, we were given a text written in ancient Moabite, and that's almost indistinguishable. I mean, there are like differences, but because it was so close, I mean, they were like right on the borders of ancient Israel and the kingdom of Judah and northern Israel and whatever. That the language is extremely similar. Aramaic's not that similar, so it's not like Mexican Spanish versus Spain Spanish. I think Spanish versus Italian is probably a fair comparison. Whereas other Semitic languages, like let's say Arabic, would maybe be closer to like Romanian, where it's like it's still a Romance language like Spanish and Italian, but Arabic.
Harsher.
Well, not only that, but it also developed further away, so it had more features of probably some other local languages.
Gotcha.
And it was more disconnected. So the more connected two languages are, the more likely they are to share terminology.
Sure.
Like even in English, we use terms like macho is not an English term. It's from Spanish, but we
Right.
say macho like to describe a guy who's macho.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So So at any rate, I don't know what's got us on this topic. We got way off. Oh yeah. So
Hebrew as a
Eduardo,
spoken language.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
So Eduardo and Hebrew was resurrected as a spoken language much later on. That's a different story. I want to make sure I don't get too far
Sure.
off because I want to answer your question about the covers. So Eduardo was interested in learning Hebrew, and I wanted to improve my Italian, and so we met up and we did a Hebrew and Italian language exchange. And what was very interesting about him, in addition to the fact that he's like got a doctorate in astrophysics and he's doing this postdoctoral research, and he played bass for a band. I didn't know much more about it than that. But he was actually really serious about learning it, because I've tried language exchanges before, and it's like usually I'm really devoted and the other person's kind of like, not as serious about it. He was really serious. And then at one point, it was probably our third or fourth meeting, I go, hey, do you want to learn some swear words? And he's like, yeah. So that's when we became friends. Like before, it was like we just had a
The
mutual
universal
interest.
language is how do
Exactly.
you use curses?
I never took more notes than that first lesson. I've still got the notebook. It's just filled with stuff I can't repeat here.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
In case any of your listeners speak Italian, they could probably guess at least a couple of things that he taught me. So the lead singer for Nano War of Steel is a guy named Carlo Fiaschi, or as his stage name is Potowoto Minimac. And he's a really talented comic book artist. They have all sorts of incredible artwork for their band, and he does their artwork. He's written, they have like Nano War of Steel comic books, and he's done all the artwork for it. And I was so impressed by it. I was in Italy in 2019, just like for a vacation, and it happened to coincide with a very brief tour that Nanowar were doing. So Eduardo was like, "Why don't you come along and be our merch guy?" He's like, "We're not going to pay anything," but and they did actually at the end, because they'd had a hit song the year prior, and so they made a ton of money. And and in selling merch, and people
Oh,
just
cool. So they gave you something
love.
on the back end type
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. But I went in knowing that I was just going to get to have fun hanging out with the
Sure.
band, and I was like, "That's cool with me," just like some food, a place to sleep, and
Mhm.
but yeah. So when I wrote my first book, I was like, I wanted to have this. I always like to have this kind of central theme, So the first book had very vaguely, it was a kind of a Star Wars theme. It's like you don't really notice it within the book, but the cover was cool, and it was sort of
Yep.
like that original Star Wars photo with like Luke Skywalker with the
Yep.
the lightsaber. And then I had the Indiana Jones theme
With
for
the Tamers.
Tamers of the Lost Ark. And so then this one, actually, the cover was done before the Tamers of the Lost Ark one because I planned on releasing the Kick-Ass Insider's Guide to Kettlebell Complexes in like 2023, before Tamers of the Lost Ark. And I and then I ended up, for a variety of reasons, I pushed it off for a little while. But what I did is I had a concept in my mind, and I wrote it out, and I sent it to Carlo, and I also I have really not. It's never been a priority to me to be good at drawing. So I did like a really kind of rudimentary thing, like what I wanted to see, and then I took a picture of myself in that pose with the kettlebells. I had a kettlebell overhead, and then one in the rack, and I was doing this like side kick, and I got a picture of myself, and I was like, I want it to be like a guy doing this, and he's kicking a guy, and on his shirt it's going to say fatness, weakness, excuses, and
Mhm.
whatever. And so he's like this, and he sent it to me. I'm like, that's
That's it
perfect.
right
So
there. Oh,
yeah,
wow.
so Carlo Fiaschi is the guy who does it. He does a really great job.
That's so cool. So this book was something you wanted to do a while ago, but then kind of put on the back burner, and then it came about. What was there a specific reason you kind of switched the order, and like what was it about? Like now was the time you wanted, to do this? Was this from your own training, or now like kind of had some different inspiration? What was the process like for that?
Well, I had written what ended up becoming like the skeleton of the book, maybe a few years prior, for as a different it was a different product that I had sold. It was initially an issue of my Inner Circle, because I wanted there to be a good resource on how to do complexes right. Because there's a lot of people
Mhm.
are like, here, do this complex, but very few people. I would say, Dan John's really great with complexes. Jeff Newport, I mean, he's got the nickname Captain Complex.
Yeah. Mhm.
Pat Flynn, spectacular with complexes. And but if people didn't know much about their work, or people who are trainers can look at all of their work and say, okay, Jeff's doing this, Pat's doing that, Dan's got this in mind when he puts this together. But I noticed that there wasn't a lot that explained to the end user exactly how and why and all of this and that. And so I wanted to condense it down into something that would be, number one, a program that would cover a lot of different bases, from strength to endurance to muscle building, um, double kettlebells, single kettlebells, but would put it together in a way where people could understand why it fit together the way that it did. And the
Mm.
reason I put it on hold is I asked Jeff Newport if he would review it, and he very kindly agreed to do it. And he gave me a couple of good suggestions. And a big one was, he said, this was like one of the really early drafts. He said, it's not really very clear that anything that you're writing is anything different than what they could get elsewhere. Meaning, like what new are you really adding to the conversation? And as it turns out, I mean, there was some like a really central feature in the book that fit exactly the suggestion that he made, but I hadn't even thought to verbalize it. And so I was like, okay, you know what I need to do is I need to go back, and I talk about it in the book, flow versus anti-flow. This is like um, that was, I think, one of the central new things that I can say that I added to the conversation
Mhm.
that previously was in there. It was hidden and it was not made explicit. And essentially, what it is this: is you've got like a nice predictable flow, let's say, to certain exercises where one thing stacks upon the next, and then you reach a movement where like all the movements are in order in a way that makes sense, and it makes it so that it's easier to perform. So you do, let's say, a clean, and then a press, and then a squat, for instance. Well,
Right.
the hardest of those is going to be the press, because whatever weight you're going to be using, odds are you can do a lot more cleans with it, you can do a lot more squats with it. And if anything is going to be more technically challenging, especially if you get fatigued, it's it's probably going to be the press. So it makes more sense, let's say, to put it before the squat in most cases, right?
Right. Okay.
So now with strength and with hypertrophy, that makes sense because what you want to make sure that you're doing is not putting yourself in a situation where you're like, oh, gee, I just did 5 exercises. Now I gotta put these giant cannonballs over my head and
Yep.
hope that my elbows lock out, despite the fact that I'm quivering. And you really don't want to do that. It's not the right time to use an anti-flow sort of a thing. You want a good flow that sets you up well for the next exercise, that still allows you to work hard, but is not going to put you in a position where, one, you're not going to be able to finish that particular element of the complex, and
Hmm.
two, you're not going to get hurt. Again, like dropping a kettlebell on your head, heavens forbid. But if you're using one kettlebell, and particularly if the goal is endurance or conditioning, however you want to call it, uh, anti-flow is a great way to make sure that you're not resting on your laurels and riding on the momentum of, like let's say you do a swing and then clean, going a little higher, and then a high pull. Well, you've got all this, momentum built up from
Hmm.
going a little higher, and then you get to the snatch. That's not so difficult. But if you go from snatch and then all of a sudden to swing and then clean and then high pull,
Mm.
the you don't really have you can't take advantage of the momentum, and so now you've got a built-in what we might call like the incidental conditioning in addition to the actual regular conditioning of going between ballistic and grind drills. You also can't the transition between those exercises now also becomes a part of the challenge because it's not an easy transition where you're just like, okay, now I'm going to go from the snatch, bring the kettlebell
Hmm.
down to the rack, and now I'm going to do, now I'm going to do a press, or now I'm going to do a squat. It's like now maybe you got to do a row, or you got to do, something, or a
Ah, okay.
deadlift, or something that doesn't logically follow it. So you're doing the exercise, you're doing whatever, however many reps, and now you also have to work your way through the transition. You can't just glide your way through the transition.
So it's interesting what you said about the anti-flow and that accidental conditioning piece from there. And I'm curious about it. Is that because with the flow, it's almost like you can easily get more into like autopilot from there, and the anti-flow makes your brain stay engaged in the process, and that's kind of that accidental piece that is challenging your system a little bit more?
Yeah, exactly. It's that and the need to make a transition. Like I think I probably first got the idea, the great Dan John. Well, I also have to say I'm very pleased that he agreed to write the foreword for it. I sent him the book to, I would think, and if he would be willing to, and he really liked it. And so I was very honored because, he's like a king in my eyes. And so I remember a couple of times there was one article that he talked about. It was probably a couple, but there was one article in particular. Um, he talked about doing in American football. They called them, I think, grass drills. So it would be like you'd be up, like doing high knees, like marching really fast in place, and then you had to get down, kind of like sprawling and wrestling. This was the I think this is how he described it. And I think it was like you do a push up and then you get back up and you're doing it again. And he said you start to realize that it's not the high knees and it's not the push up, but it's the transition getting down and then getting back up. And similarly, he talked about how you can do a bunch of squats and it's challenging. You can do a bunch of swings and it's challenging. But if you do swings and then squats, or squats and then swings, it's like you need to use different breathing patterns. It's just a totally different. They're complementary exercises, but they're different enough where it's like the transition from one to the other. Like your body is just dealing with this inertia of all of a sudden making this sudden turn in a completely different direction, and so part of it is the autopilot that you described, but a big part of it too is the transition not being as natural. Like if you do, let's say you go from a squat to a press or press to a squat, it's like you can kind of fudge, the pause at the,
Sure.
between the two of them. So it's kind of like you get to use a little bit of momentum, and it's a perfectly good movement. The I call it the long push press. I like that term, but thruster is the one that most people are familiar with. Kind of turns into like an incidental thruster or long push press or whatever, and then you're doing. And if that's what you're planning on doing, great. But a lot of people do it just because now they're trying to save energy, And
Right.
because if your goal is work capacity, endurance, conditioning, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're specifically working for, you got to work. And cutting corners is not to say that there's no time or place for it. It really depends on what the goal is. But from what most people's goals are, I think they're better off being able to get more out of a lightweight and not being able to coast through those hidden elements that most people don't really realize are there. So when you order the exercises in a certain way, you can't ignore them because there's no nice flow, there's no nice transition.
Right.
You're That's a part of the work.
That's interesting because Dan was the one that he gave an analogy once when we had a podcast where like if you were with a professional salsa dancer and they did an hour of salsa dancing versus you who never salsa dances at all,
Yeah.
you're going to get a crazy higher metabolic output in that hour than that person because there's a pattern, that's
Yeah.
connection from there. Like, yeah, maybe they can do it and they can do it really flow, but it's so auto trained in our system. And I'm in my head, I did this like a triple snatch based program for a bit of like the half snatch, then reverse half snatch, and then the
Mhm.
full snatch. Half snatch, full snatch, very easy. The reverse from dropping from the top immediately into a clean is this weird circuitry in your head because you're not used to it. There's no easy flow into it.
Yeah.
And it's much more challenging on your system afterwards in that 15 seconds that you have. It's very potent that you can recognize that.
100%. Yeah, I think it's a perfect analogy, and it's a great example. Like something you're not used to, you really got to think your way through it. And there's no point at which you can coast, and you can be like that's one of the things Pavel likes to. There was a joke that he used to tell at the certifications that there's like a new recruit, and this was a Soviet joke from ages ago. There's a new recruit who's like, they're digging a ditch. This is, that's what you do in the military. You do a lot of unfun stuff, and you're digging a ditch. And the new guy goes, "When do we get a break?" And everyone groans like, "Oh boy!" And then the general or whoever is in charge says, "Oh, you want a break?" He's like, "Well, you know how when you throw the dirt, it's in the air and it kind of floats for a little while." He's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Just throw it harder and it'll be in the air longer, and then you can take a break while it's in the air." And
It's, it's such a beautiful Pavel joke right there. It fits so perfectly in
yeah,
that. So getting into complexes, I've talked to Jeff, numerous times about his work with kettlebell muscle and stuff, and there is a benefit to it, especially the efficiency and the effectiveness that you can have with it of just short durations of workout and get a lot from it. But what
yeah.
you mentioned is the flow and anti-flow I really liked. Single versus double bell complexes. In the work that you did, like in researching, has you've seen, is there more of a benefit to working on one versus another?
Depends on what the goal is. Like speaking of Jeff, I think he had the best response ever. This was so many years ago. This was in the old RKC forum. Somebody posted and asked, somebody said, "Oh, somebody I know said that GS swings are better than hardstyle swings." And Jeff said, "Better for what?" And it's not saying that GS swings are not good. The question is, what is your goal? And he clarified that. He said, if your goal is you're training for GS, then the GS swing is going to be better because I'm going off memory now, so I could be wrong. But in essence, that's going to have it's going to be a closer approximation of what you're trying to accomplish with your ultimate goal. But the hardstyle swing, you've very likely got completely different goals. So the question, for instance, about single versus double, it depends on a number of things. And the first one, we'll just get it right out of the way, is how many kettlebells you have.
Right.
Like I make mention in the book that if you only have like one kettlebell, then you can still do the program as written, just use only one kettlebell. If you have uneven kettlebells, similarly, and you want to do doubles, you can have one that's a little heavier and one that's a little bit lighter. I think that the ideal circumstance is to use both. And so the way I have the program written is exactly that, is that you're doing both double kettlebell complexes. Those would be for closer to like just strength is the main goal, as well as hypertrophy. I've got another one that's based around, a bit more moderate rep ranges rather than low reps. And then there's also like conditioning. And one of the things that I think is really cool that's cropped up over the last 10 or 12 years has been what we now call iron cardio. You know, Brett has that great iron cardio program. And when I was originally exposed to it, it was, they just kind of called it generically strength aerobics.
Yep.
And I think Alexei Salkin, who's now a master instructor with Strong First, had written a great article on that topic. And Pavel referenced it in his recent interview with Andrew Huberman. Alexei was training, I think they were military or police in France. I don't remember exactly, but they just didn't have a lot of equipment. And so he's like, okay, here's something that you can do in your hotel room. And it was just, you know, something like one clean, one press, one swing, one squat, whatever the case may be, you know, and you could just do it like with a metronome, you know. And so the idea was to just do one with a very modest weight and just keep that going for, you know, for a long period of time. I think that's a really great way to apply the, let's say, endurance or work capacity approach with kettlebell training. And so that was the approach that I also took with the endurance complex, was this exact same idea. And for that, I think you are better off, for the most part, with just one kettlebell, especially if you're going to go for a long period of time. On the one, so number one, you could do everything all on one side, and then when your rest period is over, you go to the other side. So I mean, you're still working, but the muscles that were, you know, more specifically stressed during your previous work now get a chance to rest a little bit. So you can go from side to side, you know, back and forth. And so you can extend your training a bit longer. So even if, let's say, you know, your heart and lungs could conceivably keep going, but your muscles are just, you're so cramped and you're just, you know, so awash with lactic acid, you can't keep going. You just are, you're not going to get as much out of your conditioning like that. So I think for something like that, the idea of pacing yourself and, you know, going the distance for, you know, up to, let's say, 25, 30 minutes, that's probably a better approach if you're going to use a single kettlebell. But you can definitely use them both. And the other thing is, if you're new to kettlebell training, you can definitely still use complexes, but doubles are perilous. If you're going overhead, you know, like there are other things, like the let's say the price for failure with I don't know, like a price for failure with a double kettlebell front squat is a lot lower than like a back squat with a barbell.
Right.
You know, or you just get completely crumpled like a grilled cheese sandwich, like in front of everybody at the gym. You know, you just drop the bells and it's like,
Yeah.
it's not a big deal. But overhead, that's a different story, especially if you have two bells, because there's no way to maneuver out that doesn't involve just hoping that divine intervention just kind of nudges the kettlebell away from your skull. So there's that. I think that's very important. Whereas if you have one kettlebell and you're in that position, it's easier to use the other hand to bring it down or whatever you need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, iron cardio, we've, you know, anybody who listens to this program knows iron cardio pretty well with it. I've followed that for a while, and it's interesting because it is a complex. I think it's a little bit more of a chain, you know, versus than like a complex. And the work capacity benefit of it is so big. But what I found is the difference with complex. First, I think complexes are incredibly humbling, you know, to you. It's like, especially when you get into the moderate rep type work, like for hypertrophy, like if you're going 6 to 8 reps from one thing after another, and you're used to working with some decent sized bells, it's going to humble you really quick. Like you cannot play around with big bells right off the bat. It is
No.
going to zap you from there. In your idea with the flow versus anti-flow, is anti-flow a good like pepper in to kind of like a regular flow, or is it good to even focus on that as like the main dish of a program, or is it better to throw this in every once in a while to kind of keep that guessing type work and then have the flow more of like the mainstay?
You know, it's a good question. I think that number one, the way I have the program written out, the strength and the hypertrophy workouts in the program really more go with, I would say, closer to like kind of a natural flow where you end up with the harder exercise. Well, we'll put it this way. The less technical exercises more toward the end are the ones that you're more likely to be successful with, even under fatigue. You can safely put those at the end. And the ones that are generally a little bit more susceptible to technical breakdown are put earlier when you're fresher. Like the military press is the perfect example, you know. The anti-flow, I think, really shines with work capacity and conditioning work, but you can definitely do it with like a strength approach or a hypertrophy approach. And the idea of peppering it in periodically is not a bad idea, like rearranging the
Hmm.
order. You know, my favorite book ever by Pavel is Beyond Bodybuilding because it's just like a treasure chest of just brilliant ideas.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I find most I don't think I've ever heard anybody else even talk about it, but he talks about there was this Russian town in the post-Soviet. I mean, it obviously existed in the Soviet era as well, but in the post-Soviet era called Lyubertsy, I think. And it was kind of like a poor working class town, and the street toughs were like really tough. And there was a sort of underground bodybuilding scene that grew up from old bodybuilders and weightlifters from who were competitive in the Soviet era, and they wanted to try to wrangle these street urchins to do something a little bit more, we'll say like a little bit more productive with their time, and but they didn't have a lot of equipment. So what they would do is they would do like a set number of sets and reps with certain big compound exercises, bodybuilding. Well, we would say strength exercises, but with a bodybuilding focus, like pull-ups and squats and presses and everything like
Hmm.
that. But they would change the order. So you might still do, let's say, 4 sets of 12 pull-ups, but you might do those at the beginning in one workout, and then you would do them as like the fourth exercise in the next.
Okay. Hmm.
And you would repeat that and you would switch the order maybe a couple of times. And the rationale was explained by, I don't remember the name of the person who he quotes in there, but was that if you've already reached a certain number of sets and reps while you were fresh in a previous workout, psychologically, you know that you can already do it. And so you've got the practice with it. So you're more likely to be able to hit those numbers again under a little bit more fatigue doing them later in the workout next time. The nice thing about that approach is that if you really think about it in a way, now obviously the chief difference in the programming approach is this is what he called fatigue cycling, but it's kind of like a step periodization in a
Hmm.
way because yeah, you're changing the order, but you're doing the same sets, same reps, same weight, and then at some point you jump up, and that's kind of what you do with the step
Right.
periodization, and it's like a sneaky way of adding it in, but also keeping a certain level of novelty because you're doing the same thing, but you're doing it in a different order. So psychologically, the people who have a need for variety, it's interesting because it's different from what they did before, but it's the same thing that they did before as well at the
Mm.
same time. And I think that you can apply that with the complex as well because you might be like, you know what, like, yeah, I've already done complexes where I had to do, say, 5 double kettlebell military presses at the beginning or after my clean. So maybe what I'll do now is I'll do my cleans and then I'll do front squats and then I'll do swings and then I'll do the military presses. So you're now putting them later, but you already know you can hit for 5. And so it's
Right.
like there's no psychological barrier. You have a little bit more fatigue to push through. But I do think that it could be beneficial. And in particular, because again, you can now use this sort of like sneaky step periodization that you wouldn't otherwise have gotten to use because otherwise you're probably thinking I'm going to add another round, I'm going to add
Mhm.
another rep. So yeah, I think it can definitely work in other contexts. By the way,
Yeah.
I came up with a really juvenile joke. I was like, "What are you doing, step programming?" uh, I'm just, and I was like, "If I don't say this, I'm never going to get a chance to use it."
I love it. With complexes, I mean, I know the answer is it really depends, but for beginners who are just getting in versus more intermediate, have you found is complexes a little bit better for somebody who's had a little bit of some reps under their belt, or do you think you've seen the same benefits if somebody's brand new, to kettlebells of working in? Have you seen a difference much in that, or is it really, complexes are good, for really anybody who's got their technique down?
I think, well, it's definitely if you're intermediate or advanced, I mean, you can make great use out of complexes. But I think even beginners can get a lot out of it. And in particular, again, quoting Dan John, there was a quote. I'm quoting this secondhand because I heard John Ingham say this many years ago, so I don't know the original. He attributed it to Dan John that when you do that the kettlebells are kind of like an extended family in that you look at the different exercises and they all look different, you know. But kind of like you see a big family photo with the extended family, and now, oh, okay, Uncle Bob does look a little
The
bit
same
more
DNA's
like
in there.
so and
Yeah.
so. Exactly. And so, um, and he said, you know, kettlebells are very similar in that sense. Like a squat doesn't really look like a swing, but then you know when you do them, you can kind of see the DNA.
Yeah.
They're not twins, but they're like cousins, and you can detect that. And so the better you can connect things that people already know to something that they're trying to learn, generally the faster they can learn it. The other thing too is that if you can get people to see the commonalities and things that are different, like a military press versus a squat versus a swing versus a row, if you can get them to see the commonalities that tie them together, it's easier, I think, to maintain good technique. And this is just my presumption here in this case, but it's based around that is the fact that you can not just see it from the outside, but you can feel it. And so if you're doing them back to back, that's a good opportunity for you to see, okay, well, how is my stance similar and how is it different when I do swings versus squats? What does my stance change? How does it change when I do rows versus lunges?
Mhm.
Or things of that nature. And so beginners can do it. They definitely want to be cautious again about fatigue with moves that are a little bit more technical or moves that have like a snatch, for instance. You know, if you're just learning the snatch, maybe not a great idea to put it into a complex.
All
But
right.
when you're good at it, by all means. But like military press, if you're just very new to it, this is one of the things I think it's good about Dan John's armor building complex is just only ever one press. So even if you're very fatigued, quite often you can eke out another press.
I know that's
Uh,
why it sucks, Dan. That's
yeah,
the worst thing ever because you can always do it.
he knows. He knows. It's he's probably done it 8 ways from Sunday, all sorts of different ways, and no, so he had a really good idea when he put that together because ordinarily, and this is how my program in the book looks is that you're using the same reps for every exercise. Some will be easier, some will be harder. So you'll struggle a little bit with some, you'll coast a little bit, through the others. But there's another complex that I mentioned in there as like just as a sample for connecting what you know to something you're trying to learn. And so if you're trying to learn the swing, first you have to learn how to do the hinge, and then you have to do deadlift, and you do some progressions like you do maybe some hikes backward, you do some power swings. So I give an example that's similar to that. It might be like deadlift and then hike and then power swing and then just regular swing. And so you can see how they all build on top of each other and how even though they're different, how they all start to build up. And even if you're just doing 5 reps of each of those, like that workload builds up. And if you do it a good couple of times, by the end, you may have only done, let's say, uh, 20 swings, but you know exactly what it's supposed to feel like because you're drilling that hinge pattern and you're building on it each and every time. And you're getting in a pretty solid amount of work as well.
Yeah, I love it. Um, Alex, dude, it's so great connecting. I always really learn so much whenever I get a chance to speak with you. And I love taking something like this with this new book of kettlebell complexes, which have been around for a while. Like there's other good material out there, but to take something and put not just a new spin, but go deeper into how you can even get better at this. I just love that. I think it's really the definition of trying to master something. And I think you're really doing that from the front. So I really appreciate you coming on today and jamming again, man.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
No doubt. So if people want to grab the book, they want to check out this, where can they get this now? Is there a specific, place that we can send them?
Yes, there is a little known website called Amazon. I
Ah,
up and comer. I don't remember Jeff B something. I don't remember. He's in any case. If you go to Amazon, you can definitely find it there. If you're intrigued, but you're also not 100% sure. You're like, I don't know about this Alex fellow. You can also I've got a free challenge that you can try out as well. You don't have to buy anything or invest just yet, but it'll give you a window into my mad methods. You go to 9minutechallenge.com. That's where you can get my free 9-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge. And it does fit very well into pretty much any other program because I designed it to be, let's say, something that helps to kind of like accelerate your training by complementing it rather than complicating it.
mhm.
Um, So that is also another option, 9minutechallenge.com. It's not kettlebell complexes specifically, but you also get again, a good idea into how my system works
Mhm.
overall. But if you're really keen on the Kettlebell Complexes book, look up the Kick-Ass Insider's Guide to Kettlebell Complexes on Amazon. You are sure to find it. I've gotten a lot of really great feedback from it. People have really enjoyed it so far. And as you pointed out too, I like to keep things lighthearted. I want things to be fun. So it's not just that the cover is fun and then you open it and it's like a textbook that would put you to sleep. It's like
Yeah.
it's a lot of fun. And by the way, and I want to give a shout out to Vasily Alexiev, who kind of gave me the idea, not individually, and I never spoke to the guy, but evidently he was a guy who did a lot of complexes. He did barbell complexes, and Pavel
Mm.
mentions him in Return to the Kettlebell. He would take his barbells down to the river, the Volga River, I think, and he would do cleans and snatches from the bottom of the river, and he would take kettlebells out there and do the exact same thing. And he was the first guy to military press over 500 pounds in competition. This was when the military press was still a part of Olympic lifting. And what was especially interesting about him is he loved complexes. He had his students do them quite often because he could use a lighter weight and have them working for 2 and sometimes 3 minutes to get through the whole
Mhm.
thing. And they just put on tons of muscle, tons of strength. But there's a great story about him. He was very eclectic in his training. There's a quote where he says, sometimes I train first thing in the morning. Sometimes it's not till deep in the night. Sometimes I don't train at all. Only I know what is right for me. And he went on to press 500 pounds. But even funnier, he really liked to screw with his teammates in the Soviet team. So he would sometimes at like 3 a.m., he'd go in and like, throw beer bottles or like firecrackers to wake him up in the middle of the night. And the guy whose website I read this from, him, Jamie Lewis, Plague of
Oh yeah.
Strength.
Mhm.
Uh, his commentary on it was like he knew how to live and how to have fun because let's be honest, you're not going to cure cancer by lifting weights. So it's supposed to, in essence, it's supposed to be a good time, and that's
Right.
how I try to approach when I write books. Is that training is fun. It's like repose from
Yes.
all the stuff that we've got to do anyway. This is the stuff we get to do. And so,
Yeah.
like, don't try to turn it into a chore. This stuff's supposed to be a blast. So,
I love
but
that. What a perfect story. Shout out to
yes,
Vasily right there. So, and I'm
yes,
sure Jamie's colorful language on him is probably very entertaining as well. To
it's awesome. So, you
no doubt. Alex, dude, till next time. Thank you so much, brother. Really appreciate it. So,
pleasure of mine.
listeners, thank you so much. Check your show notes right here. So go grab Alex's new book. I'll catch you guys in the next one. All right, peace.